From parking lot fury to courtroom justice, the real story behind the slap. The calm before the storm. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, just another routine trip to the grocery store with my grandmother. The kind of day that, on the surface, seemed so simple, almost forgettable. The sun was shining bright in the clear blue sky, and I was finally getting the rare opportunity to spend time with her. My name is Ethan, and I'm in my early 30s. It's hard to put into words just how much my grandmother, Marlene, means to me. She wasn't just a grandmother, she was a second mother. She raised me when my parents were working long hours, juggling careers and life in a way that left little room for much else. But Grandma was there. Her house was my sanctuary. Every summer I would spend weeks with her, learning how to cook, hearing the stories she told with a slow, steady voice, and feeling the warmth of her presence. Now, in her 70s, she was still as sharp as ever, though her joints and knees had started to betray her. She moved a little slower, but that never seemed to diminish her spirit. On this day, she insisted we run errands together, not because she needed help, although, if I'm being honest, she probably did a little, but because she enjoyed the company. I didn't mind. I cherished these moments with her. Grandma had a strong sense of independence that never wavered. She'd walk slowly with her cane, taking deliberate steps, never asking anyone to rush for her. She always said, "I walk at my pace, and the world can catch up if it needs to." I loved that about her, her quiet defiance of a world that constantly moved too fast, too carelessly. It was one of the things that made her special. As we made our way across the parking lot of the Miller & Company supermarket, I noticed how it seemed like everyone was in a hurry. People zipped past in their cars, rushing to get a space or jostling for position as they grabbed their carts. But not Grandma. She was in no rush. "I'll meet you at the car, Ethan," she said, waving me off with a grin as she began walking toward the far corner of the lot where we had parked. She had always hated parking too close to the entrance. "It's unfair to the people who really need those spaces," she'd always say, and I respected that. She wouldn't accept a handicapped placard, even though she could have gotten one years ago. I walked ahead, eager to bring the car up to her, to save her the trouble of walking all the way across the hot asphalt. But as I was about to get in, the sound of a car horn blared, cutting through the warm afternoon air. I turned, expecting some teenager messing around, but instead I saw a white SUV revving its engine aggressively, blocking the path. The driver, a woman in her 40s, was glaring at us from behind dark sunglasses. Her expression was a mix of impatience and entitlement. She honked again, this time much longer. Then she rolled down the window, her voice dripping with disdain. "Move it, this isn't a crosswalk." I looked at Grandma. She paused for a moment, clearly unbothered by the rude woman's demands. Grandma was known for handling situations like this with a calm that always left people taken aback. Without missing a beat, she responded, "I'm walking as fast as I can, dear." That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have waited a moment or simply driven around us. But not this woman. Instead of pulling around, she swerved her SUV hard into the adjacent lane, barely missing us. I instinctively stepped in front of Grandma, my heart racing. Something in the air had shifted, and I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. The woman slammed her car door open with a force that made me flinch. Her heels clicked loudly against the pavement as she stormed toward us, her voice already shrill with anger. "You old people think you own the place," she spat. "The world doesn't stop just because you can't keep up." I tried to intervene, stepping in front of her. "Back off," I warned. "You don't need to talk to her like that." But she was already inches away from Grandma, her face twisted with fury. She continued her tirade. "You shouldn't even be out here if you can't keep up." And before I could react, she raised her hand and slapped my grandmother. Hard. The sound echoed in the air. It was unreal, the kind of slap you could feel even in your bones. I froze, my blood running cold. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Grandma stood there, still upright, but the fresh red mark on her cheek was unmistakable. I wanted to rush to her, but to my surprise, she held up a hand, signaling me to stop. Grandma didn't flinch. She didn't shout or cry out in pain. She simply stood there, her cheek turning red but her demeanor unchanged. Her eyes, sharp and steady, didn't betray a single ounce of fear. The woman stepped back, almost as if she realized what she'd just done, but her face was still twisted in a way that suggested she felt no remorse. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, my voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "You just assaulted an elderly woman." But the woman just laughed, the sound bitter and unhinged. "Go ahead," she sneered. "I'll tell them she hit me first. You think anyone is going to believe you over me? Old people like her need to be put in nursing homes, not out here getting in people's way." I was shaking now, the anger bubbling over, but Grandma, calm as ever, did something I never expected. She reached into her handbag and pulled out something I hadn't noticed before, a small, slim wallet. She flipped it open and held it up, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Retired Detective Sergeant Marlene Willis," she said in a voice that didn't waver. And in that moment, I saw something in the woman's face shift. She went pale, and all the bravado she'd been carrying melted away. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked like she had just realized she'd made a terrible mistake. Grandma didn't wait for her to speak. She simply turned toward the nearest store employee, who had started to gather near us, clearly intrigued by the commotion. "Can you please get your manager?" Grandma asked, her tone as steady as ever. "Tell them I'm requesting an officer." It wasn't what I was expecting, but it was exactly what needed to happen. In the blink of an eye, the entire situation had changed. Grandma wasn't just an old woman who'd been slapped in a parking lot. She was a retired cop, someone who'd seen far worse in her career and wasn't about to let anyone walk over her or me. The unexpected reveal. The seconds after Grandma made that casual but definitive statement about her retired status felt like hours. I could see the woman, who moments ago had been so sure of herself, suddenly falter. Her confidence, built on the illusion of entitlement, evaporated like smoke in the wind. The woman had made the mistake of picking on the wrong person, someone who had far more experience handling situations like this than she could ever imagine. And yet, the moment wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The store manager arrived quickly, his face a mix of curiosity and confusion. He was a tall, wiry man, probably in his 40s, with a clipboard tucked firmly under his arm. Without missing a beat, he looked from Grandma to the woman who had slapped her. His eyes darted to the growing crowd of onlookers, who were now whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the entire exchange. "Ma'am," the manager said, his voice laced with authority, "we've contacted the local precinct. They'll be here soon." The woman, let's just call her Karen, as the name fit her entitled, condescending attitude, looked like a deer caught in the headlights. She had clearly underestimated the gravity of her actions. The smile that once stretched across her face had faded, replaced with a nervous, almost panicked expression. "I don't have time for this nonsense," Karen snapped, her voice trembling now, no longer the shrill tirade it had been just moments ago. "I don't even know why I'm being hassled." My blood boiled at the dismissive tone she still had, as though she thought this would all go away with some idle threats. But I wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. And Grandma? She wasn't backing down either. With quiet confidence, she spoke again, her voice steady as ever. "You can say whatever you want, Karen," Grandma said, her eyes cold and sharp. "But I know exactly what you did. You assaulted me in public, and you're going to be held accountable for it. Don't think for a second that your attitude is going to get you out of this." The manager, who was clearly in over his head, shifted uncomfortably. "We've got security footage of the incident," he added, as if that would somehow reassure Karen. "I saw the last part of it with my own eyes." Karen, who had been pacing now, stopped in her tracks and shot a look toward the store entrance. She clearly didn't know what to do next. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She crossed her arms and muttered, "This is ridiculous. I'm just trying to go about my day, and now I'm being dragged into this." Grandma, undeterred, gave her a look of quiet assurance, one that didn't need to be loud to command attention. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her badge. The little leather wallet she revealed felt like the key that turned the entire tide of the situation. I watched as Karen's face went ghostly pale. The woman stammered, clearly not prepared for what was coming next. "That's fake," she said, her voice weak now, lacking the venom that had once filled it. "You can't possibly be a cop." Grandma didn't flinch. She didn't even give Karen the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on her face. Instead, she held the badge up a little higher. "Retired Detective Sergeant Marlene Willis, 30 years of service. I think that should be enough for you to understand that you've made a serious mistake." The shift in Karen's demeanor was immediate. She wasn't the one in control anymore. That little badge, the symbol of decades of experience of handling criminals and conflicts, was enough to make her feel like the world had just shifted beneath her. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. But still, Karen wasn't ready to let go of her illusion of control. Her lips curled into a thin line, her fingers trembling as she clutched her purse strap. "I'll sue you for slander," she barked, her voice still tinged with panic. Grandma, unfazed, turned her attention to the store employee who had been standing by, looking on. "Can you please get the manager?" she asked again. as though she hadn't just dismantled Karen's defense with a few calm, deliberate words. The employee nodded, his expression still one of shock. As he walked off to find the manager, I could feel the tension in the air, the feeling that something was about to break. The crowd that had gathered around us was no longer just watching. They were recording, taking photos, whispering. People had seen enough. The woman who had once been so sure of herself, her voice loud, her steps quick and forceful, was now a cornered animal. She shuffled backward, eyes darting left and right. In the corner of my eye, I saw a young man with a skateboard holding up his phone. "You're on camera, lady," he called out, his voice laced with amusement. Karen shot him a look full of venom. "Mind your business," she snapped. But the damage had been done. More phones came out. More people started murmuring. Karen's reputation was crumbling right in front of her. There was no escaping it. She had made the ultimate mistake, underestimating not only the woman she had assaulted, but also the power of public accountability. "Just stay calm," Grandma said, her tone soft but firm as she adjusted her cane. "Let the system work, Karen. There's nothing you can do to change it now." The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, the familiar sound of justice on its way. The tension escalates, the unexpected encounter. It was a moment frozen in time, the kind of moment that sears itself into your memory forever. Grandma, the steady anchor of my life, standing there in front of the car, her cheek already turning red from the force of the slap. The world around us seemed to go still, the sounds of the parking lot muffled by the pulse of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I reached out, instinctively stepping in front of her to shield her from whatever this woman, this Karen, was going to do next. The SUV had come to an abrupt stop behind us, too close for comfort, its engine still purring menacingly. I could feel the heat radiating from the vehicle as if the woman was daring us to move, to step aside. But Grandma didn't flinch. She stood her ground, cane in hand, eyes unblinking as the woman stepped out of her car. It was as if everything else in the world was a blur. The only things that mattered now were the woman's voice and the hard slap that had already left a mark on Grandma's face. And the fact that Grandma was standing there, unbroken, still holding her composure as though nothing had happened. "You shouldn't even be out here if you can't keep up," the woman shouted, her voice a mixture of anger and something deeper, entitlement perhaps, or disdain. It was clear that in her world no one had the right to slow her down. Not a grandma, not anyone. Before I could react, before I could do anything, the woman raised her hand again, but this time I was ready. The moment her hand came toward Grandma's face, I was already stepping forward to intervene. But Grandma, with a movement so graceful and deliberate, raised a hand to stop me. "Let me handle this," she said, her voice calm and steady. It was a tone I had heard countless times before, when she'd scolded my uncles, when she'd made tough decisions for our family, or when she had faced difficult situations in her long career as a detective. Grandma didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded respect. And this woman, Karen, was about to learn just how much strength Grandma had within her. The slap was harder than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a physical blow. It was a blow to our dignity, to the foundation of the respect I had for the world we lived in. I saw the impact on Grandma's face, the shock, the disbelief, but also the quiet defiance. Grandma didn't crumble. She didn't fall. She stood there facing the woman, her expression unchanged. The sound of the slap echoed in my ears. I couldn't believe what had just happened. For a moment, I felt like I was trapped in slow motion, every muscle in my body frozen. But then I heard Grandma's voice again, cutting through the fog of my disbelief. "I'm walking as fast as I can, dear," she had said, as calm as a breeze. But now, she didn't need to say another word. The woman had crossed a line, and Grandma was going to make sure she knew it. "You hit me, and now you will face the consequences," Grandma said, her voice unwavering as she reached into her purse and pulled out her retired police badge. The woman, who had been so confident moments before, visibly paled. It was almost like the blood drained from her face, and for a brief moment, she seemed unsure of what to do next. The woman, who had thought she was dealing with a frail old lady, was now standing in front of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and had spent a lifetime making sure people like her paid for their wrongdoings. "You're going to regret this," Grandma added, her tone still calm, but there was steel behind it. This wasn't the voice of a woman who was about to back down. This was the voice of someone who had the power to make sure justice would be served. And then, something remarkable happened. Karen, the entitled woman who had been so quick to raise her hand against Grandma, suddenly didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to respond. Her bravado evaporated in the face of a woman who had spent decades enforcing the law, and now she was about to witness the consequences of her actions. Karen took a step back, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. She wasn't sure whether to back off or double down, and in that moment, Grandma's calm presence was a force to be reckoned with. I stood there, still in shock, but something within me shifted. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was proud. Proud of Grandma for standing her ground. Proud of her for not being intimidated. Proud of her for showing this woman what true strength looked like. It wasn't long before the store manager arrived, along with 2 employees. One of them had already dialed the police, and the other was talking into a walkie-talkie. The manager, a tall man with wiry arms, looked from Grandma to Karen with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "We've got security footage of the incident," the manager said, his voice steady. "I saw part of it with my own eyes. We'll be giving it to the police." Karen scoffed, but there was no strength behind her words now. She was crumbling before our eyes, and she knew it. "I'll call the police myself," I shouted, pulling out my phone. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't going to let this woman get away with it. Karen, realizing she couldn't just talk her way out of this, did what any person like her would do. She tried to turn the tables. "You're going to regret this," she muttered under her breath, but it was clear she had no idea what she was up against. Grandma, meanwhile, remained unfazed. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't interested in a confrontation. She just wanted one thing: justice. I couldn't believe how calm she was in the face of it all. It was as if she had lived 1,000 of these moments in her career, dealing with criminals, bullies, and people who thought they could get away with anything. But Karen wasn't going to get away with this. Not today. As the police arrived, the atmosphere in the parking lot changed again. The tension in the air was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as the officers stepped out of their squad cars, their uniforms adding a sense of authority to the scene. "Sergeant Willis?" one of the officers called, a surprised smile crossing his face when he recognized Grandma. He approached her respectfully, his tone immediately changing. Grandma gave him a slight nod. "I'd like to press charges," she said, her voice unwavering. The situation had turned, and the woman who had thought she could simply slap a senior citizen and walk away was now facing the full weight of the law. As the officers began taking statements, I stood by Grandma's side, feeling a sense of pride swell in my chest. This was more than just a simple act of retaliation. This was about standing up for what was right, about ensuring that people who believed they could act with impunity faced consequences for their actions. And as we waited for the next steps, I knew that this moment, this day, would stay with me forever. The weight of consequences. The courtroom was quieter than I had expected. The initial chaos had died down, and all that remained was the heavy sense of anticipation. We had spent the last few weeks waiting for this moment, and yet it felt as though time had come to a complete standstill. The air was thick with tension as the judge took his place at the bench, his black robe sweeping behind him like a shroud of authority. I looked over at Grandma, who, as usual, seemed completely unshaken by the proceedings. She sat upright in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Even after everything, the slap, the shouting, the viral video, the arrest, she had not lost her composure. If anything, she had grown even more resolute, more determined to see this through. The woman sitting across from us, the woman who had slapped my grandmother in a parking lot, was a mere shadow of the arrogant, entitled figure she had been that day. Karen sat with her head slightly lowered, eyes darting nervously around the room. Gone was the designer ponytail, the arrogant posture, the defiant glare. Instead, she looked smaller, more fragile, as though the weight of the world had suddenly collapsed on her shoulders. The courtroom's atmosphere was almost suffocating in its silence. People had gathered, many of them local citizens who had seen the video online, and now they were here to witness how this was all going to unfold. I couldn't help but watch Karen as she nervously fidgeted with her hands, her eyes shifting back and forth. She had never once made eye contact with my grandmother, not since the day of the incident. Perhaps she was too embarrassed, or perhaps she simply couldn't bear to face the person whose life she had so casually tried to destroy. Grandma, on the other hand, was as calm as ever. She had made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't about vengeance. This was about making sure that Karen and others like her understood that actions have consequences. She wasn't doing this for the publicity or the recognition. She wasn't even doing this for herself, not really. No, this was for all the people who couldn't stand up for themselves, for those who had been wronged by people like Karen and had no means of defending their dignity. The judge cleared his throat, and the proceedings began. Karen's lawyer, a small, wiry man who spoke with a sense of urgency, stood to make his case. He tried to present Karen as someone who had been under immense stress, someone who had been dealing with personal issues that led to the outburst in the parking lot. He even attempted to paint her as the real victim, someone who had been pushed too far by the slow pace of an elderly woman and her slow-moving cane. But Grandma wasn't having any of it. She sat there with a quiet dignity, watching as Karen's lawyer tried to twist the situation to his client's advantage. It was all too familiar. He was attempting to manipulate the narrative, much like Karen had in the parking lot when she had tried to lie about the incident. It was the same game, the same pattern of behavior. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, addressing the judge, "we respectfully ask for leniency. My client is a mother, she has children to care for, and she has never been in trouble with the law before. This is a one-time incident, a lapse in judgment, and we believe that she should be given the opportunity to make amends without facing severe punishment." I could see Grandma's jaw tighten, but she didn't interrupt. She simply leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Karen. She wasn't going to let Karen's lawyer or anyone else rewrite the narrative. The judge nodded, acknowledging the lawyer's plea, but it was clear that the court wasn't swayed. He turned to my grandmother, who had been called to the stand. Grandma stood up slowly, making sure not to rush, her cane tapping gently against the floor as she walked toward the witness box. There was no hesitation in her movements, no nervousness in her posture. She knew what she had to do, and she did it with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in law enforcement. When she reached the witness stand, she adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the judge. "I want to thank the court for giving me the opportunity to speak today," she began, her voice steady and calm. "What happened in that parking lot was more than just a slap. It was a violation of my dignity, and of the dignity of every elderly person who has been treated as if they don't matter. The woman who assaulted me that day," she paused, her gaze turning toward Karen, "thought she could get away with it because she assumed I was weak. She assumed that because I was older I wouldn't fight back. But I'm not here for myself. I'm here for every person who has ever been mistreated by someone like her." She went on to recount the details of the incident, her voice unwavering as she spoke about the slap, the threats, the fear that had surged in her chest when Karen had raised her hand. But she didn't focus on the pain. She didn't even focus on the shock of it all. What Grandma focused on was the principle, the message she wanted to send to everyone who might have ever thought they could walk all over people just because they had the power to do so. "I don't want sympathy," she continued. "I don't want a pity party. What I want is for this woman to be held accountable. She needs to understand that what she did was wrong, and more importantly, she needs to learn that there are consequences to her actions. We can't just let people like her walk away with no repercussions." The courtroom was silent as Grandma spoke. Her words were simple, but they were powerful. In that moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning, and all that remained was the weight of what had happened, what was happening, and what was still to come. When she finished, she walked back to her seat without fanfare, her cane tapping rhythmically as she made her way across the room. She didn't need applause, and she certainly didn't need anyone's approval. She had said what needed to be said. Karen's lawyer looked flustered as he stood up to make his rebuttal, but there was no real argument left to be made. The evidence was clear, the witnesses had spoken, and the law, despite Karen's best efforts, was on the side of justice. The judge nodded solemnly and turned to the jury. It was time for them to deliberate. The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving behind an air thick with tension. The judge's gaze lingered on my grandmother for a brief moment before he turned his attention back to the rest of the court. It was clear that everyone was waiting for the same thing, the verdict. I sat there, heart pounding in my chest. It was strange how everything had seemed so ordinary before that day. Grocery shopping, a simple trip to the store. Now, it felt as though our entire world had been turned upside down. Grandma, who had spent her life serving as a protector of the law, was now on the other side of it, trying to make sure that justice was served. "I'm proud of you," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I leaned in toward her. She didn't look at me, her gaze still fixed on the door the jury had walked through. Her lips barely curled into a smile, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made me feel like everything would be okay. She had faced the storm head-on, and she was still standing tall. "I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done," Grandma replied quietly, her eyes not leaving the door. "But not everyone gets the chance to speak the truth in a place like this." It was a small comfort to know that Grandma wasn't seeking recognition for her bravery. For her, this was about something much more significant. She had made it clear from the beginning, this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that Karen understood the impact of her actions and making sure that the world knew that there were still people out there willing to fight for what was right, even when it was difficult. The jury returned to the courtroom, and the room fell into an expectant hush. The foreman of the jury stood, holding a piece of paper in his hands. He was the one who would speak the verdict, and the weight of that responsibility seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Mitchell, guilty of aggravated battery on a senior citizen," he declared. The words hung in the air for a moment before the judge gave a sharp nod. A ripple of approval moved through the courtroom, but I could see that Karen was not pleased. Her face had turned an unhealthy shade of pale, and her lips trembled as she clenched them tightly together. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that she would get away with it. Now, it seemed like the reality was sinking in. Her actions had consequences, and those consequences were about to change the course of her life. The judge stood, his gavel coming down with a sharp, commanding sound. "Karen Mitchell, you will be sentenced to 90 days in county jail, 1 year of probation, and mandatory anger management classes. Additionally, a formal complaint has been filed regarding your behavior toward the police officers during your detainment. The charges are under review, and further consequences may follow. Court is adjourned." There was a moment of silence before people began to shuffle out of the courtroom. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I looked at Grandma. She had been calm throughout, but there was a sense of satisfaction in her eyes now. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, an unspoken acknowledgement that justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been bullied, belittled, or taken advantage of by someone like Karen. As we walked out of the courtroom, the sounds of the outside world seemed to come rushing back in. The chatter of reporters, the buzz of the crowd, and the distant hum of traffic. People were still talking about the case, still whispering and speculating about the outcome, but none of it seemed to matter to Grandma. "I think you've earned yourself a quiet evening," I said, my voice tinged with a mix of pride and relief. Grandma chuckled softly, though it was a low, warm sound. "It's not about the evening, sweetheart. It's about making sure that people don't forget, not about the recognition, about making sure that others like her know that they can't get away with treating others like they don't matter." Her words stayed with me as we made our way back home, and I realized that Grandma had done more than just fight for herself. She had fought for the memory of every person who had been dismissed, ignored, or disrespected simply because of their age, appearance, or station in life. She had shown us all what it meant to stand tall, even when it seemed impossible. When we arrived back at her house, Grandma sat down in her favorite chair and relaxed, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "It's over now," she said softly, her eyes closing as she leaned back. "And I'm just glad it's behind us." But despite her calm exterior, I could see the thoughts churning in her mind. It wasn't over, not really. As much as Karen had been sentenced, as much as the law had taken its course, there was a part of Grandma that would always carry the weight of that day with her. The video of the incident had gone viral, and now Grandma's face was everywhere. People were talking about her, sharing memes, and even calling her a hero. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was that justice had been done. The next day, as we sat down to lunch, Grandma looked up at me and said, "You know, I didn't expect all of this, the attention, the fuss, but I don't mind it. What I mind is when people think they can get away with anything, that they can hurt someone and walk away without consequence." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It was about more than just one slap, more than just one woman being held accountable. It was about sending a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of that courtroom, and one that would hopefully stick with everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. The fallout. The days following the trial were a blur of news headlines, social media chatter, and neighborhood gossip. Grandma, however, seemed unaffected by it all. She was as steady as ever, going about her daily routine with the same grace and determination that had always been a part of her. Nothing about the chaos outside her door seemed to rattle her in the slightest. But for me, everything had shifted. I found myself looking at her with a new respect. The woman who had always been there for me, who had raised me, taught me, and shown me what it meant to fight for what was right, had just faced down a bully in the worst possible way and come out on top. Despite the media frenzy, the viral videos, and the endless stream of people who wanted to talk to her, Grandma remained resolutely quiet. She didn't seek the limelight. She didn't bask in the attention. In fact, she would roll her eyes whenever anyone brought it up, dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "Let them talk," she'd say. "The real work is done now." But even as she downplayed everything, I could see how it had affected her. Her face was still a little bruised, the redness from Karen's slap lingering as a reminder of what had happened. And yet, she carried it like a badge of honor, silent, dignified, and unbowed. The neighbors, too, had started treating her differently. Where once they would wave from their cars as they passed by, now they would stop and chat, bringing her flowers or baked goods. The kids from down the street had made her a drawing, a colorful rendition of her wearing a superhero cape, holding a badge and standing tall. Grandma had hung it on the fridge with a proud smile, a small gesture that spoke volumes about her character. Yet even as everyone around her shifted in their treatment of her, Grandma remained unchanged. Her sense of self had always been grounded in something far deeper than external validation. She wasn't looking for admiration, and she certainly wasn't interested in becoming some viral sensation. What mattered to her was the quiet, unshakable sense that she had done what was right. I, on the other hand, found myself unable to let go of what had happened. The slap, the trial, the social media frenzy, it was all too surreal. The idea of someone so casually and cruelly slapping an elderly woman and then having the audacity to lie about it seemed impossible to comprehend. I had spent days replaying the events in my mind, wondering how things might have turned out differently if things had played out in another way. But Grandma, true to form, had already moved on. As I sat in the kitchen with her one morning sipping coffee, I asked her if she was worried about the attention or the fallout from the case. She shook her head, taking a slow sip from her mug before responding. "I'm not worried about it," she said softly. "The world can say whatever it wants, but in the end, it's about what's inside. It's about knowing that you did the right thing, no matter how much noise is around you." Her words resonated with me more than I realized at the time. It wasn't just about the slap, or even about Karen being held accountable. It was about the lesson Grandma had taught me, that our actions, our integrity, and our character speak louder than anything else. The world could be loud, chaotic, and unforgiving, but if you stayed true to yourself and to what was right, that was all that really mattered. As weeks passed, the attention surrounding the incident began to subside. The viral video had stopped making the rounds, and Karen's moment of infamy had faded into the background of the next big news cycle. Life, as it always does, moved on. But there was one lingering consequence that neither of us could ignore. Karen's actions had cost her more than just her reputation. Word had gotten out that she had been a daycare worker, and as the details of her behavior spread, parents had pulled their children out of the daycare center. A few days after the trial, Grandma received a call from one of her old colleagues at the precinct, letting her know that Karen's employer had terminated her. She had been caught in the middle of a scandal that would follow her for the rest of her life. "I suppose that's what happens when you think you can get away with anything," Grandma mused when she told me the news. "It doesn't just hurt the person you harm, it ripples out, touches everyone around you." That afternoon, Karen's name was still making waves in the local news, but now it was for all the wrong reasons. The story about her losing her job at the daycare center was everywhere. People were discussing how entitled she had been, how her sense of superiority had ultimately led to her downfall. Grandma didn't gloat. She didn't revel in the irony of it all. Instead, she simply shook her head and said, "She'll have to live with the consequences. I hope she learned something from it." It wasn't about making her suffer. It was about ensuring that justice was done. For Grandma, that was always the most important thing. But as the story continued to unfold, I realized something. Grandma had been right all along. It wasn't about revenge, or even about the public spectacle. It was about holding people accountable, regardless of who they thought they were or how much power they held. And when people failed to do so, it was up to those of us who cared about justice to step in and make sure they didn't get away with it. By the time the dust had settled, I had learned an invaluable lesson from Grandma. It wasn't the first time she had taught me something profound, but this one felt different. She had shown me that there was strength in restraint, in standing firm without raising your voice, and in making sure that justice was done, even when the world around you tried to push you down. The weeks that followed were peaceful. Grandma resumed her morning walks, tended to her plants, and continued to enjoy her quiet life. She was as unbothered as ever by the events that had transpired, and I came to admire her more and more each day for that. But every now and then, when we would sit down to have a cup of tea together, she would remind me, "Sometimes the world needs to be reminded that just because someone moves slowly doesn't mean they don't deserve respect. You don't have to raise your voice to make a point. Sometimes, you just need to stand your ground and let the truth speak for itself. And that was the final lesson she had given me. That, in the end, it wasn't about how loud you could shout or how much you could fight. It was about knowing your worth, standing tall, and ensuring that the world saw you for who you truly were, not for how fast you walked or how much noise you made. Grandma had taught me that strength wasn't in fighting to win. It was in fighting to do what was right. A new chapter of justice. The storm of media attention had settled, but its effects continued to ripple through the lives of everyone involved. For Karen, the consequences of her actions had only just begun. What had started as an incident in a supermarket parking lot had snowballed into something far more significant, something that would follow her for the rest of her life. For Grandma, however, the battle was over. The courtroom drama had been resolved and justice had been served. But even though the noise had quieted down, the ripples from that day in the parking lot were still being felt, both in the community and in our own home. It was a Tuesday morning, about a week after the trial. Grandma and I were sitting in the living room sipping coffee when the phone rang. I had been trying to keep busy with work, but the weight of everything that had happened still hung over me. Grandma, as always, remained calm, the events of the past few weeks seemingly like water off a duck's back. She answered the phone, her voice steady and warm as always. She didn't speak much, just a few brief words, followed by a calm, "I'll be there." Then she hung up the receiver and sat back in her chair, a slight smile on her lips. "Who was that?" I asked, curious but not pressing. "It was Officer Kelton," she said, looking over at me. "They've decided to upgrade the charges against Karen. The DA's office is pushing for aggravated battery on a senior citizen. They're moving forward with it." The words hung in the air for a moment. Karen had been charged with misdemeanor battery, but now, after everything that had unfolded in the past week, the viral video, the public outcry, the evidence that was now undeniable, there were new charges on the table. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me was relieved that justice was finally catching up with Karen, but another part of me wondered if it was really necessary to push for such harsh consequences. Wasn't a public reprimand enough? But Grandma's steady voice interrupted my thoughts. "She made her bed, and now she has to lie in it," she said quietly. "I hope she learns something from this, but I'm not holding my breath." I couldn't help but admire her calm resolve. The fact that she wasn't celebrating or gloating over Karen's downfall showed me once again that Grandma's sense of justice wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. A few days later, the media's interest in the case peaked again, but this time it wasn't because of Karen's outrageous behavior. Instead, it was because of the upgrade in charges. The local news station wanted to do an interview with Grandma to ask her thoughts on the case, on the impact it had on her life, and on her feelings about the upgrade in charges. At first, Grandma hesitated. She didn't want to be in the spotlight, didn't want to make it about her. But I could tell she also understood that this was an opportunity, a way to send a message. A message about standing up for what's right, about not letting anyone, regardless of how entitled or powerful they might feel, bully or harm others without facing the consequences. We went to the station, and I watched Grandma sit confidently in front of the camera, her posture as regal as ever. The interviewer was a young woman, eager to get the soundbite that would make her story stand out. She asked the usual questions, but Grandma answered them with a calm, measured grace that only someone with her experience could pull off. "Why do you think this case has garnered so much attention?" the reporter asked. Grandma's answer was simple, but it hit hard. "Because we live in a world where people think they can do whatever they want, and there are no consequences. It's important to remember that we all have to answer for our actions. No one is above that." There was no outrage in her voice, no bitterness, just the quiet authority of someone who had seen enough in life to know that justice, when it finally comes, is always worth waiting for. The interview was short, and afterward, Grandma made a polite exit, thanking the reporters before we left. The whole thing was over in less than an hour, but as we walked out of the building, I could feel a shift in the air. The city was buzzing with the news. The story had gone viral once more, but this time it wasn't about Karen's behavior. It was about Grandma's wisdom, her unshakable composure, and the way she had handled everything with such dignity. As the weeks passed, the case continued to make waves, and not just in the media. Our neighborhood, which had always been quiet and understated, began to change in subtle ways. People started to treat Grandma with more respect, more admiration. It wasn't the type of admiration that came from fear or pity, but a quiet recognition of her strength and integrity. Neighbors who had once only exchanged pleasantries with her now stopped to chat, asking about her health, bringing over food, or simply checking in to see how she was doing. The kids in the neighborhood, too, had taken to calling her Super Grandma, a nickname that seemed to stick. It wasn't long before someone had created a meme with her face superimposed onto the body of a superhero, cape and all. Grandma found it hilarious, but she never once mentioned it to anyone. She was too modest to acknowledge that kind of attention. But even as the community rallied around her, she stayed humble. She never sought the spotlight. She didn't care for the newfound fame. It was never about the attention for her. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. As the case continued to move through the legal system, Karen's life outside of the courtroom continued to spiral. The media coverage had made her life a living nightmare. Her social media accounts were flooded with hate messages, her reputation shattered, and her career in tatters. The parents from the daycare center had pulled their children out in droves, and her employer had terminated her. She had lost everything: her job, her dignity, and her peace of mind. The irony was that Karen, who had once slapped an elderly woman and thought she could get away with it, was now facing a life that would never be the same. The entitlement that had fueled her actions was now the very thing that had caused her downfall. The public outrage had been swift, but it was the legal consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. And as Karen's world continued to unravel, Grandma simply went on with hers, steady and unshaken. It wasn't long before Karen's case came to a close. The jury found her guilty of aggravated battery on a senior citizen, and she was sentenced to 90 days in county jail, followed by a year of probation and mandatory anger management classes. It wasn't the life sentence that some people might have hoped for, but it was a significant consequence, a reminder that actions have consequences, no matter who you are or what you think you're entitled to. For Grandma, it was the closure she needed. She didn't need to see Karen suffer to feel satisfied. She just needed to know that justice had been served. And now, with the trial over and Karen held accountable, Grandma could finally move on. But as she sat down to her tea that afternoon, I couldn't help but feel that this story was far from over. It wasn't about the slap, or the media frenzy, or even the trial. It was about something deeper, something that had changed both of us forever. The world had seen what happened that day, but it was the quiet strength of a retired detective, standing tall in the face of adversity, that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The final words of justice. The sun had long since set, casting a soft glow through the living room as we sat together, Grandma and I, the peaceful evening filling the silence. A steady hum of crickets could be heard from outside, and the occasional car passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the window. Life had returned to a quiet normalcy, and yet, beneath that calm surface, there was still the hum of something significant, something I knew would stay with us, perhaps forever. Grandma had spent decades in law enforcement, her mind sharp as ever, and her sense of justice unshaken. What happened in that parking lot wasn't just about a physical assault. It was a lesson, a call for us all to recognize that strength doesn't always come in the form of force. It can be in the quiet steadiness of someone who knows exactly how to wield their power. Over the next few days, we watched as the world around us moved on. The news cycle had shifted, as it always did. Other scandals and stories took the spotlight, but somehow, it felt as though this one had stayed with a lot of people. The video of Karen's tantrum, the slap, the moment Grandma revealed her true identity as a retired detective, it all had a kind of reverberating effect. It wasn't just a viral incident. It was a reminder to everyone watching that there were still people who would stand up for what's right, no matter their age, no matter the odds. It didn't matter to Grandma that the whole world now knew what had happened. She didn't want to be the face of a viral moment. She didn't care about becoming a hero. What mattered to her was that a line had been drawn, a clear message sent. People like Karen, those who thought they could bulldoze through life without any regard for others, had been shown what happens when they cross the line. But as the days went on, something unexpected started to emerge. It wasn't just the community that was recognizing Grandma's strength. It was the wider world too. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began stopping by more often. They'd bring over fresh bread or a pie, and some of the younger ones would just sit with her for a while, asking her about her life, her career, the wisdom she'd gathered over the years. The respect that she had earned throughout her life was no longer something that was taken for granted. It was being acknowledged, celebrated even, in small but meaningful ways. At first, Grandma wasn't sure how to react. She'd never been one for attention. But as more and more people came to her with stories of how her actions had inspired them, she began to understand the power of what she had done. She hadn't just stood up for herself, she'd stood up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small or overlooked. She had shown that it wasn't about how loud you yelled or how fast you moved. It was about standing your ground when it mattered, even in the face of overwhelming odds. One afternoon, as we sat together in her garden, her favorite place in the world, Grandma turned to me, her eyes soft but intense. "You know, darling," she said, her voice quiet, "I never wanted to be anyone's hero. I just wanted to live my life the way I've always known how to, with integrity, with honesty, and with respect for others. But what happened? It's bigger than me. It's bigger than that woman who slapped me. It's about showing people that justice isn't a big, dramatic thing. It's the quiet moments, the steady choices, the things you do when no one's watching. That's what I want to be remembered for."